We overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And that's basically it, isn't it?
I do think we need to be level-headed about the economic reality and dig a little deeper into whether AI is really the cause or just the story that's being told when there are real job cuts happening. There are going to be fewer humans, for sure, but there still are going to be humans because there's going to be work that we haven't even imagined yet.
We can't control the way that businesses go about operating unless we regulate it.
When has that ever gone well? So I do think we're almost doomed to the reality of we've got to have the problems crop up before we know what we're trying to fix. Is it more empathetic to have a non-empathetic AI interacting with a customer to reduce their embarrassment, or to have them talk to a human being who might empathize with them but is still going to try and browbeat them into paying the debt that they have or that the company claims they have? Like, where does the real empathy lie?
That's a really good point. I've never thought about it like that before, that's fantastic. The following is a conversation with Ian Jacobs. Ian is the VP and lead analyst at Opus Research, very reputable company doing amazing work. Big fans of Opus Research. He has a lot of experience at Forrester. How long? 3.5 years at Forrester, just over. Ex-Genesis, ex-Frost & Sullivan. A lot of experience in the analyst world, essentially. He's got bags and bags of experience in customer service and the technologies and infrastructure that sits around that and the recipes for success from a brand and enterprise perspective. And this conversation is an incredibly interesting one because it gets into some stuff that I have never really thought about to the degree to which we kind of got into it today, which is that as we begin to automate more, what is the knock-on effect of that on your business? What's the knock-on effect of that on society? And we get into all kinds of topic areas around what constitutes human happiness and how do we foster more of it, why and if or when or how might government regulate the adoption of AI. And I've always thought that seems very heavy-handed and I don't really see the place for regulation. But over the course of this discussion, when you realize the innate nature of human beings in our quest to just improve things constantly, there is no stopping the progress that is being made in AI. I think that's pretty much certain. And the incentives economically, which is what's driving most businesses, are definitely rooted in the constant iteration and improvement of that type of technology. And we kind of play a little game and a bit of an exercise where we kind of fast forward the clock to an unspecified amount of time into the future to play out what may happen if AI keeps continuing to improve and get better and better and better. And we end the conversation quite practically with some tips and tricks and advice and best practices for businesses that want to leverage AI today, but do so responsibly and ethically. Ian opens up my eyes to a concept in ethics that I'd never thought about before, which isn't how ethical your AI solution is. It's in how ethical you are as a business in the provision of your services that then leads you to select when you might use AI or not. And so it's a really deep conversation. I mentioned at the back end of the podcast, I've been reading Plato's The Republic, so I'm in a very philosophical mood. And this is one of those conversations. So without further ado, here's Ian Jacobs from Opus Research on VUX World. All right, Ian Jacobs, welcome to VUX World, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Kane.
Pleasure. It's I've been a long time distant admirer. I've read a lot of your stuff, so you kind of like since you joined Opus and stuff like that. I'm a big fan of Opus as well. Big fan. Thanks for making some time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a topic that I love talking about. And you mentioned Opus Research. It's kind of the core of our research focus too. So everything conversational technologies related.
That's it.
It's what we do.
Nice. It kind of made me realize I've had Dan Miller on in the past. Had great conversations with Dan over the years, and recently had John Arnold on the podcast, and we had a really good discussion about the CCaaS and AI and how that market's changing and stuff like that. And I thought, it kind of made me realize how interesting it is to speak to analysts who spend their days looking at the market and assessing things and observing things and stuff like that. So I thought, how can we get more conversations like that? Ian Jacobs would be a good idea. So here we are. Yeah,
I'm always a good idea.
That's it. So nice one. So obviously you've got a wealth of experience in the kind of like research and analyst sort of community and things like that. A lot of time at Forrester, or you mentioned now at Opus. Curious to get your thoughts on, obviously AI is a huge thing now. You know, I know Opus Research has been focusing on the conversational cloud for a long time. VUX started a lot later than Opus, but that's our sort of primary area of concern is conversational AI as well. And in that, generative AI is essentially, at least the front end of it, is a conversational interface.
Yep.
It now seems as though it's kind of like, it's reaching heights that mobile reached and the internet in general reached, and all of these mainstream technologies, it's kind of like, feels as though it's branched out of the small niche kind of commentators that are passionate about it, and now it's reached the sort of mainstream. So I'm just curious to get your perspectives on, like, how do you think things feel now when you observe what's going on with generative AI compared to some of the previous waves of technology, like mobile, like the internet, like the web, like the mobile web, and all that kind of stuff? Like, where would you say that it is similar or different?
So one quick caveat, I've been focused on customer service primarily for several decades. And while that often bleeds into things like sales, particularly when it's inside sales, where it still feels like a bunch of butts in seats, right, making calls or having chats with customers, everything I'm going to talk about is primarily filtered through a service lens. So that out of the way, let me think about this question through the perspective of the biggest contact centers in the world. So if you're an outsourcer, and there are outsourcers who have 500,000, nearly 500,000 employees, most of them agents, like, that's a really good bellwether of how deep AI has really gotten into the world of customer interactions. Because these are companies that make their money off of finding the most efficient way to interact with customers, given all the promise that you and I are flooded with around how AI is going to be this panacea for high quality but low cost interactions. You'd think they would shift everything to AI as quickly as possible. Of course, there are competing business interests there, right? Labor arbitrage is how they've made their money for decades, and they've got to figure out how to marry that with AI. But that aside, what we're seeing is a lot of change in the planning around business models, and some very early efforts around things like agent augmentation using AI and replacing some of the very simple kind of tier 1, L1 interactions that we might have had, the stuff that we all know, right? The Wizmo, where's my order in retail, or password reset, or even slightly more complex things like appointment scheduling. But when we're talking about like deeper customer processes or things that really require human creativity, human empathy, those kinds of things, that there's still a human face to those. And that isn't likely to change for several years. I am not a naysayer, though. I mean, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen probably faster than naysayers think and slower than like techno-utopians think. Isn't that the way of the world, though?
Yeah.
Like, isn't that how it always goes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's always often attributed to Bill Gates, but it's actually a fella called Roy. Is it Roy Amaro or something like that? Anyway, he's the one who said essentially that we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And that's basically it, isn't it?
Yeah, in this case, I do think it is. you also tried to compare or asked me to compare this to other changes in our world that had a huge amount of hype around them, like the web, like mobile. And we're certainly seeing that, right? Like, who isn't on a podcast talking about AI right now? Who isn't writing their blogs about AI? I actually think in some ways there are going to be huge advancements outside of AI that people aren't even going to notice because they're happening under that sort of hype storm that's happening as people make improvements. And I do think we're at about the same level of hype that we were at when the web really started to hit enterprises, because it was that everybody needs a website. We don't even necessarily know what we want it for, what we need it to do, what our customers might want to use such a thing for. Like, we're about there for a lot of brands with AI. The verticals, however, are reacting differently, right? There are some that have a voracious appetite for this and a real clear understanding of where AI will help them in the near term. Again, your quote from not Bill Gates kind of proves they're probably underestimating what it's going to do to their business long term, but they have a better grasp near term. The industries that are highly regulated, that are very conservative, even if there isn't a lot of regulation, they're the ones who are doing a lot of the let's replace the L1 kind of interactions, let's get rid of the whole FAQ idea and make that conversational, or put a conversational front end on an FAQ. They're the ones who are marrying early LLM conversational efforts with much more deterministic kind of process flows behind them. So the conversation can be really free flowing, but you're not going to deviate from that process come hell or high water, either because it's regulated and we know that we've got it locked down in a way that regulators are okay with, or again, we're a conservative brand and we're okay with the conversation going all over the place. But when it comes to fulfilling the customer's requests, it's going to be locked down. So, that's what I think we're seeing. It's kind of a mix of the really forward-looking brands that are diving in deep but narrow, if that makes sense. Like, they understand the specific use cases that they're looking for, but they're not doing it for everything. But rather than being broad but shallow, we're going to answer an FAQ about everything, but only in the same way that we would publish an FAQ on a website or in a native app. These are brands that are saying, okay, well, collections. Let's use collections as an example, because you've probably seen this too. It's often touted as a great use case for conversational AI because there's the social friction and embarrassment of a human being who's in arrears on payment, having to talk to another human being to arrange a payment plan, to being browbeaten into giving more money for, right? And you remove all that by having essentially a bot, a machine talking to that customer who's in arrears. Like, that's an area where you might go really deep and understand everything about promise to pay, understand what percentage of promise to pay actually does get paid, and trying to up the amount that's promised so that, when you multiply one number by another number, you get a reasonable payment that's actually going to come in. Like, that kind of stuff, that's areas where you're seeing people go really deep. But if you're in healthcare, whether that's in the Wild West of healthcare in the US, where we've got our insane system, or in like an actual benefits system, a la most of the rest of the world, the same part of the world, it doesn't matter. In sort of healthcare delivery, we're seeing very baby steps for, sort of the obvious reasons, regulations and just basic conservatism in those industries.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if I take a little step back a second, and you were talking about, there are the naysayers who are, there's always going to be people. There is then, I suppose, the more evangelical, which is AI is going to be doing everything. In reality, it probably is somewhere in the middle, but I can sort of see. I don't really relate to the naysayers because I've seen this technology work in production. We've built a lot of stuff ourselves. It does work. And I suppose it's a case of like, if you just fast forward however many years, I can't put a number on it, but just keep fast forwarding in terms of the direction that we're traveling in. We have systems that can talk, systems that can understand, systems that can integrate and interface with all of the business systems that you have that are needed to get work done, or at least most of them, and over time, increasingly, probably all of them. And then the human touch, which at the moment is stuff like maybe decision-making, reasoning, things like, empathy, genuine empathy rather than pretend empathy.
Yeah.
These things get kind of better at doing that type of stuff, more advanced reasoning models and all that kind of. I know the research suggests that those reasoning models are not quite that good, but let's just again fast forward. Reasoning models, system connectivity, high levels of perceived empathy. So those industries you mentioned, or those areas you mentioned, like BPOs, contact centers, those companies that have potentially a fundamental business model shift coming, or at least some big disruption coming. Yeah. Do you sort of like, if you do fast forward however many years in time and you keep on charting the progress of AI and you keep on having it proliferate across more and more use cases and more channels and environments, is it feasible that it does take over? And like the whole thing about like it's going to take your jobs and all that kind of, because I've always been like, I don't know if it will take everyone's jobs, but like keep fast forwarding. Is it? Will it get to that point? Are BPOs ultimately doomed? Are CCaaS ultimately doomed? Is the contact center going to be no people and all AI? Like, where do you think it stops, if it does at all?
Well, I guess it depends on how far out we're talking about, right? If we're talking about 25, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about like a reasonable medium term, I think I may be falling into the bias of projecting from today's reality, right? And just playing that out into the future rather than seeing sort of epochal disruptions. But what I'm seeing when you look at BPOs is that they're trying to figure out ways to keep the human beings productive and driving the outcomes, understanding that, today maybe those employees, those agents, are spending 85% of their time interacting with humans, but that's going to go down to 45 or 50% in the next couple of years. The brands like BPOs who are reliant on having a human business are focusing a lot of effort on what that 35% of work that's shifting away from human interactions will look like. Some of that is more high value stuff like you were talking about, but some of it right now is still simply data labeling to improve their AI systems and then use the AI to drive better interactions. But also AI coaches, also exploring sort of processes that the brands have and see where there are gaps that AI won't be able to fill without some extra training, that kind of work. And I think that that's just going to continually progress as it moves from 50% to 25%. They're going to be fewer humans for sure, but there still are going to be humans because there's going to be work that we haven't even imagined yet as AI gets better at the interactions. Let's just look at, you mentioned pretend empathy. Well, AI is not, unless we ever get to general artificial intelligence, and here's where I'm a naysayer, but unless we get there, it's always going to be performative empathy from AI. It can't be anything but. It cannot be a human being empathizing with you. And so those use cases are always going to exist where you're going to need that human being there, right? For some of those bits and bobs, but you're just going to need fewer of them. Does that mean BPOs are doomed? Well, I think in the sense of focusing on fixed labor cost driven business models and labor arbitrage as the competitive differentiator, definitely doomed. Does that mean that they and other brands that are interaction heavy won't adapt and be able to come up with models that blend human and AI, change the pricing model to be more about outcomes? Yeah, I do think that the savviest of those brands will have a future. But to get to your actual question, are human beings doomed for having jobs, I guess? So, like, is the future of human labor, the movie Wall-E, where we're all just like, the labor is moving our floating chairs around while we eat, 5 gallons of popcorn at a time. I don't see it. And here's where, you said you don't get the naysayers. This is where I do understand the naysayers. There's some kind of innate drive in people to find value in the things that they do. And we don't have the economic systems set up yet for me to derive value from, learning how to do leather work, which I've never done in my life, or, those kinds of things. We don't. And even in more communal societies in the world, we still don't have that where it would be for 100% of people. I think, frankly, in the term that we're thinking of, mid to long term being 15 years, I don't think that we're ready for the economic disruption that will allow that to happen. Kane, maybe you've had this experience. I've had it when I've traveled in places where, let's say, there's a lot of available labor. What we find is intentionally inefficient processes to drive employment for those people. I'm not going to pick on, India in saying it was bad or not, but when I traveled there for 4 months in 1999, when I went to ship a package, I had to go to the parcel stitching walla who actually stitched it, and then to the guy who sealed it, and then somebody who would do the franking in the post office, which then had to go to a different counter to pay, and then a different one to drop it off. Like, there were 6 people involved in me mailing a package. It's gotten a lot more efficient then, but it's sort of that idea where we're going to find ways to keep people involved in these processes, even if it's at the detriment of optimal efficiency, because we don't know yet how to build an economic system that is anything but that.
That's a very interesting perspective, definitely, because I would concur that that's probably how it should be, which is that, we find a way forward that preserves the role of humans and you said at the expense of, what did you say, at the expense of efficiency, did you say?
Optimal efficiency. So 100%. However, the other side of that, and this is not my opinion, this is just thinking about what the alternative is. We can't control the way that businesses go about operating unless we regulate it, essentially, which is probably another question. Yeah.
But some businesses, I mean, you look at things like Y Combinator, they're actively trying to find the $1 billion one-person company that's leveraging AI. So there's almost like an incentive, at least in the startup world, and I don't know if this translates to the wider business world, which is try and be as absolute efficient and as lean as you possibly can and lean on technology for everything. Which I suppose, if you wanted to be courteous to that perspective, would be that that is how potentially you would focus on providing the ultimate experience for the consumer of that product or service by being as lean and as efficient as you possibly can. So,
but of course, you've now erased, for $1 billion company, you've erased tens of thousands of employees, therefore tens of thousands of salaries, therefore the economic buying power of tens of thousands of people to buy whatever product or service that one person is generating. Just back of the envelope, the dollars and cents or pounds and pence don't add up.
No, yeah.
Like we cannot do that at scale.
Yeah.
I agree with you that there are economic incentives for companies to try to get there. But again, I think that's going, you asked kind of a long-term question. That's the short term. We're looking for that. Long term, economic realities are going to settle in, and we need either governmental structures to support people with some sort of income and whatever, so that they can buy goods and services and live a life that's fulfilling and so on. Or we've got some mix where people actually are gainfully employed. I don't see any other sort of near-term, long-term future. Again, I'm not speculating about what we're going to be doing 100 years from now, but 10 or 15 years from now, there's just no way that we can make the economics feasible to have every billion-dollar company be, it's not going to be one person, but, a few people. Like it just cannot be. Now, does that mean there's not going to be huge economic disruption because of AI? I'm not saying that. There are going to be a lot of people who are out of work who are going to be trying to find different sort of areas where AI is not going to take over, right? Like for now, our AI conversation is about the conversational kinds of AI, maybe back-end agentic systems, whatever. We're not talking about robotics and instantiating AI inside of robots, but we probably should, because if you're worried that it's going to take the job of roofers and plumbers and builders and so on, there needs to be a physical embodiment of the decisioning brain that's there. And I'm not somebody who's looked at, robotics in any depth lately, but every time I do see it, it's getting better as well, but probably at a pace that is slower than the sort of conversational technologies that you and I are living and breathing. That is maybe where I have a blind spot into what the future will be. But, it's that everybody's always going to need a plumber and everybody's always going to need these physical services. But people said that about, delivery. And in the streets of San Francisco several years ago, it wasn't uncommon to see these little rolling robots where companies were trying to figure out how to do sort of last mile food delivery, restaurant food delivery, completely automated without a human being. So to your point, the economic incentives to sort of come up with these people-less systems are there. I guess I'm one of your naysayers. I just cannot envision what the economic models would be to keep enough people affluent enough to be able to afford the products and services that, a million people-less companies would be generating and creating.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I suppose the two sort of things come to mind, which is that one, obviously it's no wonder that there is, conversations and talk about this at government level and all this kind of stuff, because it's it could be a real problem, and a problem that potentially it seems as though will be solved after it happens, if it's solved at all, if that makes sense. We're not going to stop the companies that are trying to create this radical efficiency. You're not going to stop that. You're not going to stop the companies that are trying to create the technologies that will enable that radical efficiency. And therefore, unless you heavily regulate everything, which seems to kind of, it's almost like, I don't know, do you know, I was reading something, it's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Have you read that book?
Classic hippie text.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So I listened to it on when I was traveling the other week, and I then subsequently read another thing from the same author that was almost like a bit of a backstory in terms of how he come to write the book, and it cost him his marriage, it cost him his sanity. He actually literally went a bit insane and ended up in a hospital over it all. But the thing he was saying is that he could not stop himself from writing it. It was a compulsion. He couldn't stop. It was like he couldn't think about anything else. He couldn't do anything else, and he had to see it through this concept of trying to define quality that ended up taking him all the way to the meaning of life and back again. And it's almost like that happening at an individual level for that individual person. We've all had experiences ourselves, I think, where you can't help but do something. You're so compelled to do it and you just want to do it. You just go with it and there's nothing else that can sort of stop you. It's almost like we're there at a societal level and almost a global level when it comes to innovation and the creation of new technology and the constant quest to get better. So it's going to be a long-winded way of saying it's going to be very difficult to stop. Therefore, is it that it's a question of how do we come up with sufficient protection or legislation or whatever? Or do you think it's actually more of a we're going to have to just do it and then react to what happens in a fashion, if that makes sense?
So I have two different reactions. One, first, I'm going to counter your Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance with a different book called Shop Class as Soulcraft.
Right.
Which is some guy who found essentially the modern world particularly alienating. And the thing that really struck him was that the work that most of us do, we never get to see the totality of the outcome, right? We're always doing a little piece of whatever the big thing is, and we never get to see the whole thing. And so his metaphor, but also his reality is, in school, if you're in shop class, you're building the thing from beginning to end and you own the whole process and you're deriving the human satisfaction from that. And without that, we live in this atomized reality that just adds like a general sense of enemy and ennui to everybody, and human happiness sort of declines. So I would argue that that's also a probably relevant way to think about the reality that we're looking at, coming 5-10 years, regardless of whether we try and fix it now or later. We do need, I know that when we started this conversation, we're like, oh, we're going to talk about conversational technology. And here I am and you both talking about human happiness. But it is relevant here, right? Yeah. I do think we need to consider it. To your second point, or your actual only point, my second reaction to that, when have we ever seen regulators smart enough to tackle technologies that are emerging, let alone ones that are emerging this fast? And I don't, smart enough isn't quite the right thing. These are not people trained in these areas. And so even if they're doing a job of translating, they hold hearings and they do have the AI experts and the future of work experts and whatever come and testify, they then need to do a job of translating that into some legislation that doesn't have horrific unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And, when has that ever gone well? So I do think we're almost doomed to the reality of we've got to have the problems crop up before we know what we're trying to fix. A lot of the early attempts at regulation in the AI world have either been seen as ham-fisted or as anti-commercial, right? They're not friendly to businesses. Obviously, the businesses themselves often take that second argument, and AI researchers and so on often take the former argument that like you're not really looking at all the nuance here. And I don't see that really working out in a way where we can prevent it. Like as a decent model, we knew that data and the rise of omnipresent data was going to be a problem for consumer privacy, consumer protections. And, maybe the best efforts that we saw were GDPR, but there were a lot of unintended consequences of GDPR, including me in California having to do GDPR training regularly, even though it had nothing to do with my day-to-day work life, right? Like that's just the way it works in a global economy. And that took a very long time, and we're still finding holes in what GDPR does or does not allow consumers to do, or where it impacts businesses in ways it probably shouldn't, and so on. And that's when things are done well. I mean, I'm sure we can all point to the counterexamples where the regulatory frameworks that were built up did very bad things. So that's my take. I think you were kind of hinting in that direction too, so you probably think the same. Like I do think that we're headed to stumbling over the stumbling blocks before we can identify them and therefore figure out how to remove them from future paths.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of confidence in the prognostication ability of regulators to be able to identify the problems before they really happen. Where I think we're going to run into that human happiness question is in that interstitial period, because the regulatory environments don't move that quickly. All right. And so we're going to have the problem, and then the regulation comes many years later. What happens in that period in between where the problems are just there regularly? I mean, in some ways, we're living that now, right? That's the deep fake problem as we get to the point where voice cloning is really possible and not just fake images. We haven't figured out how to deal with that, and those things can do real harm to both individuals, groups, and society at large. So maybe we're living in that interstitial period right now because we've identified that it's a problem and we haven't figured out the regulatory part. But we're just going to repeat that cycle with each new problem that comes to the fore.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, definitely. I think you could probably argue that we are getting into a bit of that phase now. You know, Microsoft recently cut something like 8,000 jobs. Salesforce have just cut to 4,000 jobs. And it's all with the veneer of because of AI. There's a lot of undercurrents going on that might suggest it's not particularly the case. But, you know, AI is at least being held as the poster child for job cuts in businesses.
And this is where politics really does get into it, because how many of those public firms are also doing things like stock buybacks, which indicate that AI is a smokescreen in some cases, or a convenient excuse for the sort of cost cutting that the brands were going to want to do anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to besmirch any of the brands that you mentioned, but if we look broadly, we've seen brands doing stock buybacks and layoffs at the same time. You're like, well, yeah, what's the actual driver here for these things? That said, as I pointed out, I do think that AI is going to impact the type of work that brands need, and that's going to probably lead to reduction in the labor force until possibly they realize the other things that they need people for. And I'm not talking about the Klarna situation where it was like, no, we're just going to have AI for everything. Oh, wait, nope, maybe we need some people there, you know, because that's a whole different set of issues that we're looking at. I'm talking about big technology companies. Again, obviously easy to see why they would be early adopters of AI beyond the conversational front into process automation on the back end, in the product ideation, potentially even, right? In sales and marketing, qualifying leads and deals and all of that kind of stuff. You know, again, outside of the realm of just the one-on-one interactions with the consumers that are served by those brands. And that's probably, as maybe you were hinting, a leading bellwether. But I do think we need to be level-headed about the economic reality and you know, dig a little deeper into whether AI is really the cause or just the story that's being told when, you know, there are real job cuts happening today. Longer term, again, I don't know if I'm sanguine about it, but I recognize that that's the reality that's coming, that we're just going to need fewer contact center agents. In the contact center, we're going to need fewer QA people. We're going to need fewer workforce planners. And AI is going to supplant a lot of the labor that those people have done. And similar dynamics are going to play out in lots of other areas where so-called knowledge work is king. That's sort of the midterm reality, again, until regulatory frameworks come up with it, economic systems change, and we move into a truly post-socialist, post-capitalist, whatever reality, and we have a new system that figures out how to provide human happiness when people aren't engaged in quote unquote productive labor. I guess my real thought here is we're thinking too small when we talk about AI. Like, we really do need to be thinking at an existential level about what this means for society at large. There are certainly academics who are thinking about that, but in the AI community, often it's a race to, let's see what we can get this stuff to do, and can we get to, general AI. Even Sam Altman seems to have pulled back from that goal, but that doesn't mean there aren't others who are focused on that goal. I without looking at the broad impact. Now, it's a lot to ask if you are a procurement guy at a manufacturing company and somebody's coming and saying, hey, we can reduce your 100-agent contact center to 20 agents and some AI. It's a lot to ask to say, well, what are the existential implications to the future of humanity of you buying this? I think that's to your point. The economic incentives are to drive that motion forward. But, there are people like you and I who could take a step back and still advise clients and do work for our clients, but also start to instill some thought of, is this a good thing or not? And I'm not being completely Pollyanna-ish about it, because if we think about accessibility as an example, right? We've instilled accessibility conversations into almost everything that technology does. We have accessibility checkers for websites. We have accessibility experts who work on design flows for voice systems and so on, because the problems have cropped up with accessibility, and we've decided as multiple different societies, because there's multiple different regulatory frameworks, that it is important to have a level playing field for everybody, that everybody can access these services, goods, and so on, right? It's not ridiculous to say that we need to start to think the same way in the long term about the impact of AI on society, just as we did in inaccessible doorways that led to ramps, and inaccessible pavement that led to curb cuts that generated benefits more broadly than for the accessibility community that initially took advantage of it. I think the same dynamics need to be at play here.
Yeah, I can't argue with any of that. I think what is interesting among that is that you referred earlier to Sam Altman, who seems to have taken a bit of a step back from the whole Gen AI, artificial general intelligence kind of mantra. There's a lot of research coming out now, which is actually showing that what's promised from these models isn't the reality. I'm sure you saw the Apple paper that was pointing out the reasoning models and saying that, for light reasoning, they're a load of rubbish. For moderate reasoning, they're kind of okay, but for heavy reasoning, they're again a load of rubbish. So it's kind of like, it seems, and then also, there was some research from MIT recently which pointed out how only 5% of businesses have got any value or deployed Gen AI out of the pilot phase into production. And so there is the alternative view. And I think that people like Jan LeCun and Gary Marcus and others share that kind of perspective, which is that actually the technology that we're talking about, generative AI, which seems to have been the catalyst to all of this discussion for some reason. I know there's many different forms of AI, and it's not just AI, it's technology in general and all this kind of stuff. We can definitely agree to that. But all of the stuff that we're talking about thus far is predicated on the technology continuing to improve, not necessarily exponentially, but continuing to improve to a place where it's good enough to do all of the things that we fear it might. Whereas maybe it doesn't ever get that good. I don't have any perspectives on this, but I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on, will the technology actually get to a place where it's capable of doing all the things that we fear it will do? Or is there just some fundamental limitations either in the technology or of our understanding of even consciousness or intelligence or whatever it is that we need to know to build these systems limited?
Right. So I'm old enough that I probably won't live to see what that outcome is one way or the other. I mean, I'm not that old, but still, if we're talking 40 years in the future, probably not going to be around to see it. The reason I'm bringing that up is that's the time horizon that we probably need to be looking at. And I think these people that you're talking about kind of are falling into some sort of bias. I'm sure it has a name where they're looking at the current problems and projecting the problems forward rather than the apocalypse that we probably have in front of us. So I actually think it's just way too early to be that negative about it. You know, as an example, that MIT paper, you pointed out the key thing. What they were looking at is POCs and what makes it out of POCs. Well, we have to look more broadly at POCs. POCs often fail. It's kind of the point, right? Like, let's see if it works and we can derive some value from it. We wouldn't expect 95% of Gen AI POCs to get out of POC into production, or we've got the wrong definition of what a POC is. Like, we're not thinking broadly enough in what we're experimenting with. So I looked at that study and I was like, yeah, the people are picking the wrong use cases and there are a lot of problems with how brands are going about it, but it's not a general indictment of the technology. It's that we haven't figured it out yet. I think the same is going to be true long term. I'm sure I could come up with some equivalent if, you know, you were in Philo T. Farnsworth's garage in Palo Alto and he was building, you know, what became the first real TV set. Would you have been able to say all of the changes that was going to happen, plus all of the technology hurdles that it faced, trying to get everybody to move from black and white to color and all of those things? I don't think we could have. I don't think anybody could have. And I think that's kind of where we are with AI, not just, as you're saying, not just Gen AI, but AI writ large. I am somewhat conservative and would like there still to be a role for human beings. You might have gotten that from my moving quickly to the existential problems of this. But I don't think that that's actually a problem of the technology not working, right? I think in a lot of cases, those issues that we're having, the roadblocks that we're having, are going to be overcome in some cases quickly, and in some cases it's going to take a long time to figure out. You know, okay, so reasoning models don't work that well right now. That's not the only innovation that we're going to have. I mean, let's think about how many different new types of models have crossed our desk just in the last, 5 years. Like, it's the pace of people investing in the research and therefore driving new approaches is just so breakneck that something is going to come along and we're going to say, oh yeah, well, we screwed up with the reasoning models, but now, the Eclair approach is going to be the best thing ever, or whatever we're going to end up calling it. I don't know. I have no idea. I guess I haven't had breakfast yet, so I've got pastries on the brain. Whatever it is. The same is true, to go back to something we talked about before, which is the performative empathy, right? Right now, we've got human beings who are freed up by AI so that they can actually become more focused on empathy. That's been the story in contact centers, and in a lot of cases, it's just a good story. But if you see how somebody who's a supervisor in a contact center, how their work has changed, they're becoming empathy coaches and they need emotional intelligence skills. And we're starting to see very large BPOs, to go full circle in the conversation, change job descriptions and change hiring processes to start to look for those skills, less so than can we be the rah-rah team leader that we used to be? It's like, how do we get the emotional distinctness of humans instantiated in the interactions because of all this AI? I think that's probably also something that we're going to see longer term, but now focused on AI. Okay, your performative empathy starts to move towards something that's essentially indistinguishable from human empathy, but only because they're human beings who for a long time are both modeling those behaviors and actively training and teaching those behaviors. But if you today looked at the technologies that are supposed to generate empathy from those machines, I like your word, rubbish. It's just absolute rubbish. Like it's terrible. But is that going to be true longer term? No, I don't think so. I think we are committed, whether we like it or not, to this stuff working. It just may not be the things that we're looking at today. Again, to go back to reasoning models, empathy, even empathy understanding, like really understanding my reaction to something. We've got a long tail problem with that right now. In systems of understanding, the investment are in either prosody of speech, if we're looking at actual speech, not written text, that may or may not be culturally dependent, right? I used to live in Thailand, and if you get angry in an argument, you've lost because you've lost face. Whereas when I lived in New York, if it's whoever's loudest essentially wins, right? Like but where is the investment going? It's not going into Thai. It's not going into deep understanding of the nuances of Thai, or even something as widespread as Swahili. So but is that going to change? Yes, as we figure out how to have these systems become more self-learning, those are the kind of problems that are going to be overcome by technology. I think my real point is every problem that we can point to today is something that we could probably envision with enough investment having some solution to, whether or not the solution encompasses words that we even know today. Like it's going to be something that we can't even envision. That's where I sit. Do I love that future? Maybe not necessarily, but I do think that's where we're going.
I think one of the challenges is that I don't know if it's an artificial general intelligence challenge or not, or whether it is a gap that this technology will need to cross if it is to get to the point of artificial general intelligence, which is the point at which you could probably safely say that all knowledge work is done and all other, that's the tipping point, isn't it, basically?
Yeah.
But I think that there's a couple of areas that you've mentioned that humans obviously fare well in, and you mentioned empathy. Now, I don't really know much about the theory of empathy, to be totally honest, so I might be completely getting this totally wrong and mistook, but how do you know whether somebody's being empathetic? And I'm not sure whether or not that you will deduce empathy simply from the words that are said, or even necessarily from the tone that it takes. I think there's something else going on with empathy that is an actual connection between two people. And I'm not sure whether we understand what it actually is. Therefore, you can train a model to recognize the symptoms of it by just saying, here's a bunch of empathetic conversations, reproduce that, please. But it won't actually have empathy. And you can say that for a lot of areas. Like, I might think that you're an inquisitive person, but that might be not because you ask questions. That might be a symptom of being inquisitive. But maybe you ask very pertinent questions that other people just wouldn't have thought of. And maybe what I'm trying to say is that you're really insightful, but I think that you're just inquisitive because you seem to be asking the right questions. And you can't train a model on what it is to be inquisitive or what it is to be empathetic or whatever you just have to give it the tokens of it and the symptoms of it, and so that it reproduces it. So it kind of brings this like ethical question, I suppose, or even capability question. Two things: is it ethically sound to be essentially just parroting what we can observe as traits into a model that has conversations with customers? And secondly, is it feasible that an AI solution will ever bridge the gap to genuine empathy, inquisitiveness, charisma, whatever you want to call it? Or does that not even matter as long as it seems like it does?
Well, so I would take a step back and say, this is a problem with human-to-human interactions as well, right? It's nigh on impossible to teach empathy to another human being if they don't naturally have it as an adult. Obviously, that's the job of parents as you're rearing a child. But when we hire a contact center agent, in Colombia or in the Philippines and they're serving a customer in the UK or the US, are they being genuinely empathetic, or are they reading an empathy script, right? Mm-hmm. They're saying, oh, I'm really sorry that you've experienced that. But it's their 38th call of the day and they're completely burnt out and they don't have any empathy left. So we have that problem with humans today. It's not like this is something new. I do think that it becomes more, I don't know if ontological is the right word, but a deeper question where, is AI ever going to achieve consciousness, and is consciousness required for empathy, right? Because empathy, as we would define it in a dictionary, is being able to relate your consciousness to mine and understand it at that level. So without that consciousness, it's almost like an irrelevant question about whether AI is ever going to be truly empathetic. Is it ethical to try and teach it the behaviors of empathy? No, I think it's the best thing that we can do. But we still, I mean, if we're looking at it today, we still need to apply our empathy lens to things like business process about even when to use AI and when to not. I'll go back to my collections conversation. Is it more empathetic to have a non-empathetic AI interacting with a customer to reduce their embarrassment, or to have them talk to a human being who might empathize with them, but is still going to try and browbeat them into paying the debt that they have or that the company claims they have? Like, where does the real empathy lie? And I've argued and worked with brands to try and identify points in processes where non-empathetic AI is actually a more empathetic choice. Can we get AI to understand where that is maybe more of a real question here. You know, it's not the only one. We work with a brand that provided information to teens about sexual health and pregnancy and so on. And again, is it more empathetic to have just sort of a just the facts man AI system presenting the information in a non-judgmental way than a human being who may be non-judgmental, but the fear of judgment is there on the side of the teenager, right? So empathy isn't as straightforward as, can AI be truly empathetic? But can we use AI to provide the kind of needed empathy that really drives the value of the organization doing collections, which is monetary value, or the social good of the social services organization that's providing sexual health and pregnancy information to teenagers? And I think the answer is yes, we can, even if AI is never truly empathetic in the sense that we think of it. We can use it in empathetic ways.
That's a really good point. I've never thought about it like that before, which, yeah, that's fantastic, that in terms of figuring out when is it most empathetic for the business in that interaction to use AI, because it's better for the end user in an empathetic way, is a very interesting lens on it. I've never thought about that, which is that's really interesting, because that brings it down into, you know, a business lens, starting to think about being empathetic, starting to think about where you might use it. Given everything we've spoke about in terms of, we seem to be on this journey, we seem to be on this path. We're probably just going to have to, you know, respond and react as we learn and as things happen and stuff like that. What can businesses do in addition to the empathy point to essentially start to chart their way through this landscape in a way that is, you know, successful, because that's what they want, but successfully done in the right kind of way? Like, what are the considerations that a business looking to leverage AI because it sounds interesting, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves, and what kind of best practices do you think they should adopt?
In some ways, this goes back to Casablanca, you know, and play as time goes by, Sam, because what are the lyrics? The fundamental things apply. In this case, the fundamental things that we've known as business realities still apply. Are you broadening accessibility to your products and services? You needed to do that when you did web design. You needed to do that when you did native mobile app design. You need to do that when you're designing your voice UI or when you're designing your conversational system, right? That fundament is still a fundament. It hasn't changed. But from a practical technology point of view, I think one of your previous conversations on your podcast is really illustrative of the kind of decisions that people will have to make and think about, which is we're being shown a future on the conversational AI side where the vision is, one giant prompt box, right? It's like all LLM driven. That's all you need. You need to become brilliant at prompting, and it will design all the processes on the back end, and it will figure out what data it needs and go collect it, and it will figure out the ideal number of steps and all of that. And on the other, we've got the more traditional deterministic workflows. And then we're seeing a lot of brands who are blending the two. And I think that is really where brands on the conversational side can really start today to sort of say, okay, it's great if I was the one person or maybe even 30-person e-commerce startup where really I don't have processes yet. I'm a startup. Let the AI go wild. And what's the worst that's going to happen? We're going to ship something to the wrong address and we'll have to reship it, right? Like the cost of screwing it up are low. For most brands, though, like how do I take a pragmatic approach to blending the processes that I've built that I know work, the people's knowledge that I know is solid, and the ability of LLMs to be creative? Whether it's be creative in the actual language that they're generating when they're talking to customers or agentic systems being creative and building out processes. Where do I lock things down? And where do I let the LLMs and agentic systems not go wild, but operate the way that they're designed to operate? Again, you already had a conversation kind of just on that topic, but I do think that that's a very real way that brands can start to grapple with this future without saying, oh my God, the world is changing so fast. I don't know what to do. Well, you do know what to do. You just want to figure out what you need to do to improve it, to broaden your access, to open up new markets for you. Like I live in the contact center world. One of the best things I've ever heard one of the best things I've heard this year was talking to a BPO about what AI impact has been for their customers. And what they said was, yeah, the brands are saying, okay, you're giving us 35-40% savings on what we used to have when we just had human butts in seats. We're going to pocket 10 or 15% of that profit and show that we're doing great things with AI. We're going to take the other 25% and invest in expanding access to service. So they might have offered 9 to 5 service 5 days a week, and now it's 24/7. Or they might have only offered voice. Now they're doing voice plus web chat plus WhatsApp. Or they might have been doing just English and Spanish, and now they're tackling German and French and whatever other languages, right? So they're taking the benefits of AI and actually having monetary value applied back to the business, but also looking at it in a very pragmatic way to expand the experiences that they can provide. And I think that's also and pragmatic, I think, is my key word here. Like, let's look at the pragmatic ways that you can start to deploy this to expand the reality of your business, whether it's offering new products and services, expanding availability to service, which, if you're doing it well, should increase loyalty, wallet share should go up, all the puppy dogs and rainbows benefits that brands are looking for, right? So that's where I would say brands could start today.
Nice. Yeah, I agree. I think that's all you can do, really, isn't it? You can only start by putting one step forward and do it in the way that's right by the business, right by the customers, right by the staff. I do think, I think that my summary of this conversation is that it's probably opened my eyes a little bit in terms of some of the areas that I probably don't think about as often as I should, which is more of the very high level, more sort of existential view on things, which is where this stuff could go. I think sometimes I get trapped in the weeds of like, the latest report, the latest piece of research, the latest kind of project and stuff like that. So I do think it is, I concur with your sentiment earlier on, which is that for the right people, and in fact for everybody, I think we probably are required to take a step back a little bit, have a bit of a broader perspective on things in order to be able to move forward in the right kind of way. And so, yeah, definitely a bit of an eye-opening discussion. And I kind of think I've always appreciated the, this is what all the headlines are about a lot of the time, isn't it? AI is taking your jobs and AI is taking over. I've always been able to thread the cotton, if you like, from where we are today to how that might happen. But I think it's been very interesting getting into a bit more details about some of the things I hadn't quite considered, in terms of like an alternative economic model, if there is one, the incentive structures behind, why people are doing this versus not, and the type of work it could replace and stuff like that. I think it's nothing but an interesting time to be living.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting is a good word. The problems that brands are coming to us with, again, I'd say the fundamental things still apply, right? It's like, how do I do the things that I used to do with AI, but do more of it? Again, expanding access to service. How do I create new products and services that incorporate AI experiences that I could never do because I could never afford the human labor of having a human involved in that part of it? And that includes things like field service. Right? Like I don't know how much you ever looked at field service, but it was the promise of field service that mobile was going to change things dramatically because now you have a camera and you can go and take it and show a human agent. This is, 10 years ago, the back of the router, and he can help you or she can help you figure out the wiring and whatever. Or in the case of something more complex, you've got a field tech going out to work on an HVAC system who can then show images back to some centralized knowledge resource, right, where they have experts in essentially a contact center to help. And that happened a little bit. But when you can actually have that intelligence on board on the device, and it doesn't require that back end labor, which is great if, you have to go fix something and you're out of network range, like you don't have access to that. But now you do. You'll have access to be able to fixing that kind of stuff. So we are in that world today, for sure. Where that goes, yeah. I wish I was more optimistic about human nature, frankly. Yeah. I do think your idea that there is an incentive and drive to optimize as much as possible with AI is true in kind of a late stage capitalist world. But maybe we will come up with new economic models that will account for the changes in technology and the changes in society that technology hath wrought. Maybe. I'm not Karl Marx here. I'm not the big one who's trying to come up with a new political and economic system. I don't know.
Well, if it was that easy, it would have been done already, wouldn't it? Yeah. I think it's an interesting time, as I said, and I don't think. I think there's something about human nature which is all about continuously improving. If you look at sports people, athletes, even career people, a good proportion of people who are just driven by some intrinsic motivation to improve and get better at something. And I do think that same nature gets transferred into businesses that create cultures to that effect, probably influenced heavily, or if not derived directly from capitalism. But it seems to me to be a human nature type of thing, and I don't know if there's anything else that could possibly stop the progress.
I don't know either. I will go back to the shop classes Soulcraft thing, because I think in lockstep with that is also some intrinsic desire to be able to hold an entire system in your head at once and understand the whole thing, whether that's the leather working that I was joking about earlier, or a customer service process. right? Wouldn't it be great if you as a consumer, you would like it, you would understand what happens on the back end so that when you say something, the actions that are taken because of that are transparent to you. Not transparent in that they're being hidden, but like you understand how the outcome that you desire is achieved. And I do think that we're falling into the trap of atomizing things even more rather than giving people more of a global view of each process, each thing. Whether that translates into a change in the type of work that we want to do, and right, we're all going to go and rebuild an engine on our Indian motorcycle, as Zen in our motorcycle maintenance guy, or we're going to go do leatherworking or macrame or whatever it is, like anything where you can understand from beginning to end how your inputs and your labor result in some outcome. I think that we are getting to the point where that's becoming more critical for people, and they just aren't realizing it. They're not seeing that the lack of that is making them unhappy. And can AI help, or is AI the driver to have the freedom and time to do that? We'll see.
Yeah. Yes. We'll see. I mean, that's it's a big conversation, and that is something else that could be explored in a whole other podcast, which is essentially in a world where AI is doing everything and people are not doing work, there's the question of purpose. And I think that the whole idea of what you were saying there in terms of like being able to own the whole thing applies, and I would say applies certainly probably to you and to me. I think probably both of us, given the nature of our work, have something in us which is more like a creation type of thing, where you want to create stuff and own stuff and build stuff and manifest stuff. And I think there's a lot of people like that. However, I suppose I remember coming across an argument somewhere, and I can't for the life of me think of where it was, which was about how some people derive purpose from their job, and some people that are probably perhaps not, I don't want to use the word educated because that's probably not the right word to use, but there are a certain group of people who do certain types of jobs that, maybe they're not highly skilled jobs, or at least not highly valued jobs, and therefore the remuneration for the job is not quite sufficient. And therefore, what do those type of people do? Because not everybody's an artist or a sculptor or a writer or a musician or whatever it might be. For me, it would be great if I was just going to get paid some sort of government-sponsored wage for me to sit about making music and writing articles and, being creative all day. That would be brilliant. But not everyone subscribes to that.
I think it just may not be labor as we think about it. Let's think about other domestic labor or societal labor even, right? Just sure, environmental work, those sorts of things. It's not work if you're just planting trees as your hobby, as my wife does. Like, she's basically a wannabe orchardist. It's not a job. It's just she derives a huge amount of satisfaction from it. Right now, there's no support for that, obviously, other than she has to do a job to pay for what people would say is her hobby. But again, I think it's the soul craft in the shop class, the soul craft idea. That's the soul. She's crafting her soul. She's doing the work that crafts her soul.
Yeah.
You're right. It could be a whole other podcast about like, what do we do? What is the sort of post-AI human look like?
Yeah, there's almost an exercise to be done, which I'm in the latter stages of listening to Plato's The Republic. Don't know if you come across it, but I don't know. I don't know.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah. To be honest, I'd actually never really heard of it. But I just been through this process. That Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Once I listened to that, and then I thought, I kind of got onto this like little kind of rabbit hole as you do. I thought, well, there's loads of people out there that I've never really heard from. Like I've never read anything by Plato, never read anything by all these kind of like ancient kind of philosophers. And I thought, let's just go and have a look. And basically, that's kind of what that's all about, is essentially the definition of like the ideal society. It almost feels as though like 4,500 years later, that's kind of where we should be again, is trying to define what that looks like.
Well, there's a saying, it's probably in academia, but all philosophy is just the shadow of Plato. So yeah, I think we
There you go then.
probably keep circling back to the idea, the Platonic ideas, not Platonic ideals, ideas. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Interesting. There you go. Yeah, maybe it's another one because I think we could talk about this all day. It's very interesting stuff. But Ian, I really appreciate your time, my friend. Really interested and enlightening conversation. Didn't really know where it was going to go, but I think it went in lots of mysterious places that were very interesting. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I feel like we had the conversation at the bar just without the beer or whiskey.
Yeah. Next time it'll be in San Francisco in the rain with the beer and whiskey.
Okay. Sounds great.
Nice one. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again on the next one. Cheers now.